and we hope you're having a really, really good time. Again, welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival at Bank of Baroda Charbagh, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. We are delighted to introduce Blood Legacy. When British Caribbean slavery was abolished across most of the British Empire in 1833, it was not the newly liberated who received compensation, but the thousands of enslavers who were paid millions of pounds in government money. The descendants of some of those slave owners are amongst the wealthiest and most powerful people in Britain today. In conversation with author of Empireland Sathnam Sanghera, Alex Renton, author of Blood Legacy, Reckoning with the Family Story of Slavery, delves into the story of his own family's history as slave and plantation owners and questions how much we owe it to the present to understand the legacy of the past. May I please invite Sathnam and Alex on stage, please. Can we have a huge round of applause for them?
Hello, Alex, and hello, everyone. So you've written this amazing book called Blood Legacy, which is moving... Sorry?
Yes. Okay.
I need to get... Oh, you go for it.
Alex Renton is a British-Canadian journalist and author. His most recent book, Blood Legacy, has been long listed for the Baillie Gifford Prize.
That is a crucial detail. Every prize listing really matters.
And Sathnam Sanghera.
Oh, there's more. Oh, my God.
Yes, we just discussed.
I wasn't listening.
Give me like 3 lines. I promise I'll be done after. Sathnam Sanghera has graduated from the Christ College, Cambridge, with a first-class degree in English language and literature. He's been shortlisted for the Costa Book Awards twice. His third book, Empireland, How Imperialism has Shaped Modern Britain, became an instant Sunday Times bestseller in 2021 and was named Book of the Year at the 2022 British Book Awards, and also inspired Channel 4's Empire State of Mind. Sathnam, over to you.
Third time lucky. Thank God you mentioned my degree. My mother would be very happy. Alex, you have written this amazing, moving, harrowing, incredibly scholarly book about how your family were involved in the darkest episode of slavery. And but before we get onto that, I guess we need some context. And your family, I hate to reduce it in this way, your family were very posh.
Still are. I'm not sure, is my mic working? Yeah. My family, if my mother was here, she'd say we still are posh.
But your dad was a Tory MP, and I guess both sides of your family come from Scottish aristocracy. Is that fair enough?
Well, my dad, yes, was a Tory MP, but actually not that long before him. They rose from being shopkeepers in Edinburgh because they bought some land in Candy in what was then Ceylon, and set about their own bit of the looting of parts of South Asia. So that's where the Renton fortunes come from. My mother's family are ancient Scots, the Ferguson clan, landowners going back into the mists of Irish history.
So basically your family are the people who are basically running Britain for quite a long time, right? When did you... And actually, I should say you went to Eton, although you got expelled.
I was expelled from Eton, it's true.
At what stage did you find out that your family were involved in the transatlantic slave trade?
Really quite recently. I mean, when I was 5 years ago. And so like a lot of posh people have many privileges, and one of them is they know where they came from, often for several hundred years back. And that's, in our case, because of a great pile of family papers and accounts books and letters going back really to the 17th century, kept in the old servants' hall, the basement of the old family house in Ayrshire in Scotland. And my grandfather, who was a well-known historian in Scotland at least, had catalogued all these and written some books from them. And I was, I loved my grandfather. I was just fossicking a few years ago down in that basement, looking at his handwritten catalogues, and realized that Jamaica and Tobago kept coming up. And so I said to my mother, what's this about? And she went, yes, a bit embarrassing. And she said her father had told her that we, the Fergusons, like everyone else, as he put it, meaning other posh people in Scotland, had been briefly involved in slavery but hadn't made much money. And of course, she shouldn't feel bad about it. So he died in 1971. So no one had looked at these things. I had as an investigative journalist, which is what I've been all my life, I couldn't possibly not but start reading.
I guess your family's involvement in slavery is not untypical of the social class. When you go through the records, a huge number of aristocratic families had interests in the Caribbean, is how they euphemistically described it, or they were agriculturalists and so on. So it turned out that actually it wasn't a small episode in your family's history. A huge number of people died. I guess your family's involvement resulted in, I think you say, 285 people dying. What was the thing that was most shocking for you when you started looking into it?
I mean, 285 listed deaths. I mean, there would be many more. And of course, there are the descendants of those who were enslaved who did produce children who then continued into post-emancipation to live in a Jamaica in extreme poverty and denial of rights. So there's a whole further collateral damage to think about, which goes on till today in the West Indies. But I think for me, I started reading the letters, and they're very emotive, and they're very personal, because the first of only one of my ancestors ever went to the Caribbean. This was a younger brother called Jamie, who was sent out in 1770 when there was a gold rush going on because of the new islands that had been taken from the French. And Scots led that gold rush, and he and my family, like many others who were already landed and had some wealth, decided to dispatch young men to go there. So reading Jamie's letters back to his brothers who bankrolled the trip, I got to see him very quickly as someone not unlike me. We talked the same language, you might say. And he was a modern man, educated not unlike me, and with moral beliefs not unlike me. And this was really uncomfortable, and I thought important, because my education had taught me to think of slavery as something done by another people, a whole culture and centuries away. But I laughed at Jamie's jokes in his letters home. And I also began to get very excited, as I felt an affinity with my 8 times great uncle, as he expressed moral ideas. So he arrives in Grenada, which is a sort of a hub for everyone going to the other islands, meets lots of Scots planters, talks about how dreadful and drunk they are. It's their own fault that they die so quickly, he says, and talks about how everything he hears makes you think that when he starts being a planter, he will be humane to the Africans, because that makes economic sense, and also moral duty demands it. But he's only been there 2 weeks, and as the years go by, he's not humane at all. And in fact, he and other members of my family treated the Africans literally like the farm animals they also owned, and they felt morally able to do that. And so that was that shock, having been sort of seduced by him. But and then of course, the details are stark. I mean, there is a letter when he writes about, so he starts in Tobago, he buys 300 acres of jungle at a place called Bloody Bay, and 10 Africans newly arrived from the Igbo, he describes them as, so probably from Nigeria, from West Africa. And he writes these very moving letters about rolling up his sleeves alongside them and working to clear the jungle so they can get their fields ready for cotton and indigo, and how he works alongside them and he tends their wounds and they trust him. And he's clearly proud of this. But in the next paragraph, he draws a picture of his and his older brother's initials intertwined, James and Adam Ferguson. and says that as soon as Adam can write back and approve of this logo that he's designed, he will send to Barbados to have it made in silver so they can mark the slaves. So the men he's working alongside, he's planning to brand on their chests. So there are moments that are literally nauseating.
Yeah, and it's very harrowing the way you describe your reaction to the revelation that children were involved and died and so on. I feel like I need to make clear to the audience how unusual it is to have a white man from a posh family in Britain talk about this, because I can't think of many. There's Harewood, the people who own the Harewood house who are related to royalty. They've talked about the fact that they were involved in slavery a bit on TV. You've got Richard Drax, the richest MP in Parliament, whose money all comes from this background, who's been forced to talk about it because he still owns the plantation. But there are many of you. Were you anxious about breaking ranks, and is that how it felt to you?
It didn't feel like breaking ranks. It felt like a story that needed to be told. For a start, this archive, which frankly everyone in the Caribbean should have access to, was hidden in a basement and hadn't been looked at 70 years. It was my duty to share it. But I think much more than that, as I started to talk to friends whose background was from West Africa and the Caribbean about what I'd found and what I should do, I began to realize that and forgive me, I began to realize what an ignorant person I was, despite being a liberal, anti-racist journalist all my life. And that I began to realize just how deeply connected the moral decisions my ancestors made on grounds of race, because they employed white people as well, but they did not treat them with anything but decency, how that was connected to the racism that still toxifies Britain today. And that to say that, and that this was done by people like me, and illustrate it properly, and acknowledge it, seemed to me an overriding prerogative. But there were difficult. Some of my family weren't happy about it at all, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What kind of reaction did you get from your family? Because I know that some of your family would say they're working class and they were going to be tarred with the knowledge that their ancestors were involved in slavery. Did they get very cross? What were the kind of reactions you got?
I think, I have a huge family. Lots of cousins, and we're all very much in touch. And the ones of my generation were involved in the kind of ancestor worship that posh Britons indulge in. So for the older they were, the more shocking it was to have a myth, because the subsequent Fergusons became Governor Generals across the Raj and in New Zealand, and soldiers of empire and so on. And we were brought up to admire them. So I was really pulling the carpet away from the feet of a lot of the older relatives who had a notion of the goodness of the people they'd come from. So some of them found that very tough. One of them will never speak to me again. And some of them found it absolutely correct and apposite. The younger it's interesting. My youngest nephews and nieces kind of went, well, what are our black mates going to say when they found out? Which is a fair point. But I think now that none of them, I hope none of them regret me doing it. But the thing is, I've got crosser and angrier about this over the years. We published the book in 2021. Not a single window in the still existing houses that my family enjoy, one of them in Scotland has been broken, and I don't think any aggression has come their way. But a huge amount of aggression comes to friends of mine like you for writing about this subject in entirely racial grounds. My family had felt slightly uncomfortable about our history being told truthfully, but we killed and spoiled the lives of hundreds of people. Our ancestors did. A little discomfort today in return for all that privilege isn't really too much to bear.
You raise the issue of race, which I think is important. I'm very self-conscious that, I'm an Indian, British Asian. It's mostly an Indian audience here. There's very few black people at this festival, and it makes me feel self-conscious because this is their story in a way. Did you, as a white man, have anxiety about being the one who told this family story?
Yes, enormous. I mean, I had trouble getting the book published. I mean, get someone to commission it. British publishers are very scared on various different grounds, and I was told overtly that a white man couldn't write this book. And so I had to listen to views like that. Interestingly, no one of colour told me that. It was white publishers who told me that. But so that was one aspect. But what I realised very early on is, because our account has virtually nothing about the real lives of the people who we enslaved. And at any one time, there were 200 enslaved people on the plantation. They exist only as statistics. They exist in angry letters from my uncle to the white managers of the plantation, which kind of go, so one of the newly bought girls died when she fell in the slurry pit, and one of the mules died when it was stuck in a fence. Could you please try and do your job better? So one of the things that was crucial to the book was to go, which my family basically had never done, to Jamaica and Tobago, to the plantations and the sites of them, and talk to the people who live in poverty there now, who may be descendants, and ask them what they thought I should do, both with what I've inherited in terms of my privilege and with the information I had. And those were the most fruitful, and they're recounted in the book, the most fruitful conversations that I had. But that was the only way to get the fact that the enslaved stories will never be told.
Yeah, but I think you make that clear, and also I should say you're giving the royalties away to various black charities, right?
Yeah, I couldn't possibly make a profit on the back of slavery again. It was sort of undoable. But
it's a really valuable thing, I think, because there's so few people from these families talking about this history. I think it's very valuable that you're white talking about this history. It's also valuable, and there's things that happen in the story that I've not read anywhere else. And one extraordinary thing that happens is that one of the enslaved, called Caesar, they were given these ridiculous names from literature, weren't they, and from the classics. Caesar actually travelled from, was it Tobago? From Jamaica to visit your relative to ask for manumission, or
to ask for justice. I mean, it's an extraordinary story from about 1780, and when this is not the Tobago plantation, but an established plantation that my grandfather and great uncles bought. Great, I should say, bought with another Scottish family who had a lot of money from banking and slavery, the Hunter Blairs, and yes. So a man who called himself Augustus Thompson, once he'd escaped the Jamaica plantation, left his family and wife and mother on the plantation, and smuggled himself on a boat to London, and appeared one winter morning on Sir Adam Ferguson, Member of Parliament's doorstep in St James's, to say, I've been really mistreated on your plantation as a slave. And it's an extraordinary story. It's almost unique in the history of British Caribbean slavery. And it's deeply, deeply upsetting because, and again, we have his deposition, which he dictated to somebody, so that the mistreatment is clear and there, and it's the most savage bit of information that ever appears in any of the papers. Mass beatings and cruelty and theft and beatings of his children and so on. But what Sir Adam then does, and Sir Adam is is a major figure in the a minor figure in the Edinburgh Enlightenment, a sort of friend of Hume and Adam Smith and so on. Sir Adam talks to this man who's appeared on his doorstep and gives him his word that if he returns to Jamaica, as is his duty, no harm will come to him. So he then helps Caesar get on a Royal Navy ship back to Jamaica, away from London, where at this point in the 1780s he's not a slave, he's a free man under British law by then, back into slavery with this gentleman's word. But as soon as he gets on the ship, my great uncle writes a letter to the plantation manager basically going, do what you like with him. And you realise for a man like Sir Adam to give his word to a white man would be, better than a cheque. I mean, unbreakable. But again, we're back to the racial basis of this, that to give his word to a black man and send him back to certain death meant nothing.
Yeah, shocking the kind of casual way that happens. And you discovered during your research that actually you are part Nigerian, a very small part. And
yeah, I mean, DNA testing is kind of throwing everything up, particularly in the former British Caribbean, where people are now very aware, just how much Scots DNA they have in places like Guyana and Tobago, and it's a good thing, it's a healthy thing. So I did my DNA, and when I was in Tobago, where my 6 times great uncle had been, I rang up everyone in the phone book in Trinidad and Tobago with the surname Ferguson, and well, a lot of them thought I was a nutter, but the ones that were prepared to talk, we met, and I gave them DNA kits as well. And in the process of it, I found, and I'm very lucky, I found that my 2.8% West African DNA, I was able to work that out back to an enslaved woman who'd been the common law wife, or whatever you'd like to call it. I mean, there are other interpretations of a plantation owner called De La Roche in Jamaica in the 1760s. But so that's moving and important to me and my family. But it's not what you see when you look at me. But it just tells me yet again that judging who people are by the color of their skin is completely ridiculous, as if we didn't know that already.
You said at the start that your family, I think it was your mother, said, "Oh, we didn't make that much money out of it anyway." Is your mother or your father? Your mother said that.
That's what her father said to her.
Yeah.
When he told her about this.
And the interesting thing is, when you go through the records, it turns out your family didn't make that much money out of it. And actually, it makes you think about why they bothered, because it was a lot of admin. Obviously, a lot of moral questions came up as well, because the debate at the time was being had in Britain.
Absolutely. I mean, Sir Adam Ferguson, the Kilcarran, the family house in Ayrshire, his next-door neighbour, another MP, Kennedy of Dalwarren, was a very prominent abolitionist. And the 2 local clerics, this is by the 1790s now, 2 local clerics, again, prominent in the Scottish slave trade abolition movement, and who he knew and had to dinner and correspond. I mean, there's no question that he knew there was people he respected held a very opposing view to him. And you look at it and you go, so, I mean, I worked out that probably at best it was 20% of the family income at the height of slavery, the profitability of plantation slavery, the end of the 1790s. When income tax starts in 1800, it becomes clear that the British government is making more than the family ever was from a whole range of taxes on Africans, on sugar, on plantation fences, and so on. And that money goes, of course, to finance the wars that Britain is pursuing against the French. But it isn't the sort of money that the banking and insurance families made, which are enormous fortunes. But I can't discount it, and nor can I discount the fact that at the end of slavery, as you referred, in 1834, when they still had nearly 200 enslaved people on the plantation, they received this extraordinary payout. Where about £14 per head of enslaved person, which was the money that the Tory government at the time had to find to get the votes to get the abolition bill through. And so my ancestors received about £3 million in today's money. And I go into the book on some of the fripperies on which they spent that, but they also spent it on railway shares. So it's interesting when a lot of people tell you and
railways being built in Britain.
This is now late 1830s, and in the 1840s, that was the great. It was like Bitcoin today, except you're more likely to make the money. But you and I get a lot of pushback in our writing about empire and about it's not important today, but it's very clear that those enormous payouts from government, the biggest loan the British government ever took out in the 19th century, £20 million then. Were used to help the people already rich invest in the great industrial revolution boom that was then coming.
And actually, Britain only stopped paying off the debt of £20 million in 2015. And at the time, the Treasury, the government account, sent out a congratulatory tweet saying, "Great, we've just paid off the debt we paid to the rich people of Britain for slavery."
The Treasury tweet is kind of stupid. I said, so everyone in Britain today who pays tax can be proud of helping end slavery. So, which, of course, there was a lot of extremely rude tweets sent in response to it. But it is interesting. I mean, and that there's Chris Manjapra, who's here talking about the ends of empire in a book which will be discussed in a session tomorrow. Talks about how that system for buying off the wealthy in order to emancipate, it happened across many different cultures, but most starkly in Britain. And of course, everyone else. One of the many conversations I had in Jamaica, people would go, "Well, did you do anything good with the money?" And you had to go, "No." And most of all, my Sir Charles Ferguson, who is now the head of the family, and my 3 times great-grandfather, has a statue to him, 2 actually in Scotland, because of his philanthropy, because he was a great builder of churches and schools for the poor of Scotland. But of the 200 people and their children on his plantation in Jamaica, no schools, no churches, not even a grant of land. So even right into, he's a highly religious person, a member of the governing body of the Church of Scotland, but that core racism remains at the heart of his thinking.
And people are in Britain, very defensive about this history. They're defensive about empire. They want to talk about the Indian railways. They want to talk about abolition. We abolished slavery, then we pursued abolishing it around the world. A famous historian once said, it's almost as if Britain only got involved in slavery so that it could abolish it.
For the satisfaction of abolishing it. Yes, Eric Williams, a brilliant Trinidadian historian.
Have you come across that kind of defensiveness in response? What has been the reaction to your book?
I think a lot of non-fiction writers who go into complex areas will tell you they learnt an awful lot more after publishing the book than they knew before. And what I learnt is being very sad indeed. I mean, I had no idea in my liberal, white, privileged bubble just how racist so many people like me are and how angry they are at any attempt to reverse the story of empire and slavery that they were taught. And earlier in your session with Emily Benn, she talked about the British amnesia about the bad sides of empire. I'd go further. I went to Eton, as you said. Look at the incredibly expensive education I had. It was propagandistic. We were victims of a propaganda war that still continues in the way we try to educate people in Britain. I was taught that slavery ended in 1807, and that William Wilberforce was the saint who did it, and that Britain led the world, taught the rest of the world to do this, and that we should be very proud of what we did. Going to the records, you realize that this message started in about 1840. Think Britain's pride about ending slavery is a message that goes back to then and has been kicked around ever since. Some of you will know that great, I've forgotten its name, Our Island Story, the most successful English language history book. Anyone read that? I know it was published in India. First edition in 1902. Stayed in print till 2002. H.E. Marshall.
David Cameron's favourite book.
David Cameron's favourite book. A 1950s edition of that I have, 500, 600 pages illustrated. It's where you learned that Alfred burnt the cakes, if you were a British schoolchild at my age. It has half a page on slavery. Britain enslaved 4 million Africans, and that half page is titled How We Freed the Slaves.
Yeah. Just one more question before we open it out. If there was one myth you could educate people about in Britain about slavery, which is the one you would tackle?
Sorry, one
of all the myths and all the defensiveness, things that people say, oh, it was the Africans that did it, it wasn't us. we abolished all slavery, we were barely in it. What's the one most damaging myth that you would want to tackle?
There are many, many myths, but I think the one that is probably that it's not important to Britain today, that it's ancient history and done by people who were not like us. I think it's crucially important to if we want to live in a happy, civilized, decent nation, is to acknowledge that many of the structural racism that is a reality in Britain today come from those attitudes that enabled otherwise decent people like my ancestors to treat fellow human beings like animals. And so British slavery history is not over until we deal with the consequences of British slavery history. And my great friend Sir Geoff Palmer, who's a campaigner on this, says we can't change the history, but we can still change the consequences. And I find that really inspiring.
Okay, questions. We have people in yellow jackets who will bring a microphone to you. There's one here. I can't see. Oh, there's one over there. Why don't we go for the man in the middle who's got his hand up? He's got a brown jumper on.
Thanks for the insightful discussion. I'd like to commend you firstly. I think you are miles ahead in terms of acknowledging slavery. What I'd like to discuss is a question on the inherent human nature, right? What leads to slavery, right? We didn't discuss in the talk, but I just have a question on that. That I think humans fundamentally have a urge for status and power. At least that's what I have observed, in some circles. In India, I have been privy to some intellectuals for some ethnic groups. I won't mention it right now. But if you get a group of 4 or 5, intellectuals from an ethnic group, for example, a Bengali or a Marathi or Punjabi, which I am, right? And after conversation came out that, they have an inherent status thing that, okay, we are the most intellectual within the group. Within the country, or we have contributed more towards the country. And I was just thinking that, if you give them more power, it can, very easily translate into that, a domination like the Europeans thought at the time that, okay, we are more superior to others. So, there is a inherent desire for status, I think, in humans, in artists also, right? Some artists think that they're more superior to others. So do you think that is a background underlying, that is always going to be there in some other form?
Okay, she's saying, is there something in human psychology that kind of encourages people to enslave?
We look at human history, and it's clear that slavery in one form or the other is part of most, if not all, cultures and all histories. I think I'm not sure I find that perception that useful in looking at what the British and other European nations did in the 18th and 19th, 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. Because for me, British slavery was, transatlantic slavery was in a category of its own, sui generis, because it was legal, encouraged by the government, enabled by the government, and entirely based on skin color. And while the many stories, wonderful stories of Ottoman slaving and East African Arab slaving and slaving in India and the caste system in India and so on, this is unique, and not least because it was done by modern men at the beginning of the age of liberalism.
Thank you for that question. Is there anyone on that side? I feel like I need to be fair. Okay, there isn't. Okay, let's go for the guy in the pink shirt in the middle.
Quickly, we hear discussions about reparations from states, right? Like the state is responsible for maybe giving reparations to the descendants of slaves. But as someone whose family is directly involved, isn't there a burden on the families themselves directly to be paying or looking into reparations being drawn from those families who profit from it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, in contrast to Alex, the Drax family have been asked this repeatedly by Black Lives Matter protesters, and they've said absolutely not.
yes, and I'm in contact with some members of the big Drax family who rather disagree with Richard Drax MP. And one of the issues is that his amazing family story of slavery in Barbados, he won't even allow anyone access to the documents, to the papers, which is another crime against the descendants of the enslaved, that they are not allowed to know their own history, I would say. But yes, I mean, so certainly many members of my family have embraced the notion that we do have there is reparative justice that we can take part in personally. And one of the pleasures of publishing the book is I have had a fair amount of correspondence from other rich families and people in Britain who have done the simple act of research and found out that they too have this history and they also want to join in. So on the book's website, bloodlegacybook.com, there is a reparations page where I list some of the tokens that we're doing education in the Caribbean and in Britain and other charitable work. I know one family where the patriarch has said, they're very intimately connected with slavery history, that no one's getting anything when he dies. It's all to be sold and parceled up in various initiatives. But I mean, and for me, that's an entry drug. If you get people to accept some kind of personal liability, then we can start talking about the national reparative justice issues. And as Sathnam said, I mean, shamefully, our country, Britain, has not even begun that discussion with CARICOM, with the Caribbean nations, though the Dutch and the French, to a degree, have. We've refused even to talk about it.
Well, King Charles has just said that he'd like to learn more about slavery. So he's already 72, so give him time.
Yeah, what has he been up
70
to? He's visited all these places.
Right, next question. There's one right at the front. You were right at the front of my talk as well. Don't ask me about Khalistan, man.
No, I won't. Sathnam Paji said in his session that, Britain is not even ready to acknowledge or talk about be it slavery or their racial aggregation and whatnot. So what is the solution? When will the justice come? When will justice come to the Caribbean, to the colonial lands? Where does it end? What is the solution?
That is a great question. I'm glad that you didn't go into Indian politics.
Yeah.
But because there's the CARICOM group of countries have all got together and they've listed demands, they've listed what they want.
Ideas, really.
And loads of other countries are doing similar things. And yet, Britain, I think you said that they didn't even send a letter in response.
The 2014 CARICOM group of nations, a formal letter asking to begin talks about reparative justice on 10 points. And the British newspapers went, they want £3.7 trillion off us. But no one had ever said a figure. This is made up in the Daily Mail. What they wanted was to talk about educational opportunities, about debt forgiveness, which has worked very well in other lower income countries, about visa, and apology. And it's so interesting. I mean, when I went around Jamaica and Tobago talking to all sorts of people, and people said an apology would be nice, and it's not too much to do. And successive prime ministers of Britain have failed. I mean, there's a similar debate about our history in India, have failed even to, so frightened are they by their lawyers saying, you'll have to end up paying up if you admit anything. Failed even to apologize. What was clearly a genocidal crime and clearly done with no moral reason at all, other than done for greed. What do you think on that one?
Yeah, I think there's such, actually, if you want to ask a question, put your hand up and I'll let someone. Got a question over there in the middle, lady with a hat. As she gets there with the mic, I think there's small things the royal family could do. For example, a member of the royal family, I can't remember who, was given a silver bowl of thanks because they defended the slavers. And I think the royal family could do something with that bowl,
But if they won't do anything with the Koh-i-Noor, I mean, why would
it's not a valuable thing in itself. It'd be hugely significant for lots of people. Sorry, question.
Yes, hi. This is, I'll apologize in advance because this is going to be an awkward question. You mentioned in your DNA ancestry, there's a West African lady. And I think the kindest version of it is that the lady was a common law wife. do you have relations or relatives who don't look like you, illegitimate family, that your family, that your ancestors took advantage of local women? Is there something that you've explored in your book?
It is, and particularly what happened to women on the plantations, who, of course, people without any rights anyway as enslaved people, no rights whatsoever, even over their own children. Sorry, the common law wife phrase is not one I use in the book. You have to assume rape.
Yes.
I mean, because
that's why I said the kindest version.
Yeah.
Is
Let me take it back. I'm sorry. No, you have to assume rape because what agency did they have? What ability to make any choices at all? Do I in my family have anyone who doesn't look like me? Yes, I do. But from modern relationships. But
is there anyone you found out was family through your research?
So this is actually on the Renton on my father's side. So Elizabeth, the enslaved West African woman who had a child with this white planter, her grandson, I'm just wondering, so my grandmother's great-grandfather, my grandmother was very posh. I really wish she was still alive so I could tell her this bit of news. I have a portrait of him. He's a white, bewhiskered Victorian gentleman who was a trader from Jamaica to Liverpool. He owned 2 enslaved people himself at the, which is quite common, towards the end of the era. But he looks white and pink-nosed, but he was, what was in his birth certificate, he is a quadroon, which means he has 25% African ancestry. So the cover-up was going on even then. And the stories are always more confused when you get down, as I've been able to, I'm so lucky, get down to the nitty-gritty.
Okay. Sorry, I should probably take another question.
Just a subset. Sorry about that. Is it just one, though? Because that seems like a rarity, that you would just have one relative who's a quarter black.
No, so his mother, who was half black and free, had this is all from Baptist church records, had three different partners by whom she had children, none of whom she was married to. So yeah, of course there are others. But if you do 23 DNA, that test, I have a lot of cousins in Elizabeth's parish, Jamaica, who I'd kind of like to meet.
Question here at the front.
Good evening, sir. I think the seed of slavery is still there in India, in the villages where rich people are there. It has not died right yet. Is it?
That's a good question. Does slavery still exist? But I mean, I guess transatlantic slavery was different in that it was industrialized, or not?
I mean, one of the many criticisms I get, and my book does make people angry, people who look like me angry mainly, is, why are you wasting your time when slavery is probably more common in the world in terms of numbers than ever in history? And people use the term modern slavery. I mean, the British government passed an act called the Modern Slavery Bill. For me, in Britain, that's wrong, because if you're, a unfortunate Eastern European woman trafficked into sexual slavery in Britain, and you escape, the law will be on your side. The law was exactly the opposite in the terms of the slavery era I'm talking about. But of course slavery still exists. There's low-wage slavery, there's caste-based slavery, but we're into terms of economic injustice and cultural injustice, not the legalized acts of a government.
It is sort of disease right now,
I understand.
Thank you for your question. Yes. Another question, and while it's at, who else had their hand up? There's one over there, guy in a maroon top on the right. Before we take the question, I wanted to ask you about indentured labor, because 1.3 million Indians, I think, went from India to do the work that the slaves were doing in the British Empire, in places like Jamaica, Mauritius, where I've just been, and it was compared to slavery. Do you think it was like slavery, or was it different in any profound ways?
I kind of feel a little guilty on this one, because I always sort of went, well, indentured labour, you had rights, it was a fixed term, there was some monetary benefit to your family with, the initial payment, and of course, my family used indentured white labour, often Scots from their own clan or from their own around them, which was welcome to those young poor men, because arriving in Jamaica with a job was a chance to get rich. But I read this amazing book, which I know you've read at all, Gayatri Bahadur's Coolie Woman, about her ancestors who went from Rajasthan to Guyana, and you realise that they were betrayed and enslaved in a very real sense by the British planters yet again. I mean, promises were made to them about being sent home, being at the end of their term and so on, and they had very few rights. I'm much more open to that notion, and that's something you're writing about at the moment.
Yeah, I know. I think, the one sign it wasn't as bad as slavery is that the descendants of the indentured in places like Mauritius have done much better than the descendants of the enslaved on the same island. So we take that question over there.
Alex, I don't know how much cricket you follow, but now I know the reason why West Indian quartet of fast bowlers, Malcolm Marshall and others, used to bowl so many bouncers to English batsmen back then in 70s and 80s. My question is it very liberating and very relieving to to have this sort of feeling being a descendant of those people? And secondly, in case it is so, would you advise, in your view, for some of us Indians also to write down things of excesses done by higher caste people to lower caste people, which is something comparable to slavery?
It's a very good question. I should say that's going to be the last question because we're out of time. But I'm going to preface it by saying that Alex, this is not the first time that Alex has taken on his social class. He's also done amazing work in TV and books in exposing all the paedophiles in boarding schools around Britain. So you've got a long history of taking on your class. But has it been, as he asks, has it been a therapeutic process?
I've had a very lucky and privileged life. I emerged from British traditional boarding schools with a real anger about injustice and people using their power wrongly on those who are weaker than them, and that's kind of, I've been lucky enough to get employment kind of pursuing those things, whether in newspapers and in broadcast, and I was incredibly privileged to have this amazing, not many historians, I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist, get this kind of source material I stumbled on in a cellar in my grandfather's old house. Yeah, I enjoy my work. I'm glad to have brought this story out. It's caused some trouble, but nothing like the misery my ancestors inflicted. In India as well, I have an ancestor who was an EIC merchant in Bombay before he went back to take control of the slavery plantations. So I'm lucky in I can say I'm sorry for what they did, and I can say, while not guilty, I am ashamed that people like me didn't do more to acknowledge it earlier, because it makes a difference.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to stop there, but I'm so glad you wrote the book. I think you're doing the descendants of the enslaved a real, justice. And Marlon, can you stay in your seat, because I've got to see you before I go. Thank you.
Marlon James's book, The Night Women, was very important to me when I was writing my book, I should say, if he's still in the audience.
Thank you so much, Alex Renton and Sathnam Sanghera, for this incredible discussion.